they found was that the subjects in the study, and these are type 1s taking SGLT2 inhibitors, saw about a 22% reduction in cardiovascular events, a 28% reduction in kidney problems, plus the usual reduction in blood sugar and a little bit of weight loss. And this is key, with no incidence of ketoacidosis during the study. So apparently a little bit of education can go a long way in using these meds safely. Welcome to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, where our goal is to keep you informed, inspired, and a little entertained on all things diabetes. The information contained in this program is based on the experience and opinions of the Integrated Diabetes Services clinical team. Please discuss any changes to your treatment plan with your personal healthcare provider before implementing. Howdy, partners. This is Buck Scheiner reporting on the ADA 2026 Roundup. Hee-haw. We'll be getting to my city slicker brother Gary in just a minute, but ADA 2026, it was marred a bit by some conflicts between the police and some of the scientists who were presenting there. There were some skirmishes and some issues with Breakthrough T1D and some of their fundraising subsidiaries, but overall, I don't think anybody was hurt, so that's a good thing. So my city slicker brother Gary's got all kinds of stuff to report to you, and first I'm going to ask him, automated insulin delivery. You learn anything new at this here conference? Thanks for that introduction, Buck. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we did learn quite a bit about making optimal use of AID systems and trying to improve time in range and achieve better averages without increasing hypoglycemia. There were some presentations that showed how using tighter bolus settings actually improved overall control without increasing the hypoglycemic episodes, making the carb ratios more aggressive, the correction factors more aggressive, can help in a lot of cases. Now, it's not going to work for everybody, but it is something that if you're trying to tighten up, might be worth it. And it was also stressed that the continuous glucose monitor data needs to be reliable and consistent, which isn't always the case. So, wearing the sensor pretty close to either your pump or your receiver or your phone is a good idea. And, with systems that allow calibration, doing finger sticks now and then to make sure the CGM is performing well is recommended. And if the CGM is not performing well, if it's way off from the finger stick values, turn off the automated features of your system until the sensor is back in range. Well, thanks for that. Now, what about our little ladies out there who are having a baby and they're pregnant? What are some of the strategies they can use? Okay, so we learned a little bit about this, Brother Buck. There's some specific things we can do during pregnancy to achieve those stringent targets that are usually set. One of the toughest things to achieve during pregnancy is the post-meal targets. The goal is to keep blood sugars below 140 at the high point after meals. And honestly, even people without diabetes sometimes go above that. So keeping it below 140 when you've got diabetes is not the easiest thing in the world. But some of the strategies that were recommended do make a lot of sense. We've tried a lot of these here in our practice. Jenny Smith, who's our pregnancy specialist here, she uses a lot of these with the clients that we work with. People who use the MiniMed 780G, it suggested putting that active insulin time at 2 hours. So the system doesn't overestimate the amount of insulin on board present and accidentally back off on the amount of insulin basal insulin that's given after meals. Tandem users are encouraged to use sleep mode around the clock and not just during sleep times. Since the algorithm, it aims for tighter levels. It actually starts increasing basal delivery when glucoses are heading above 120. It doesn't wait until 160. But it's important to note that when you're in sleep mode, the system is not going to deliver automated correction boluses. So if you're running highs, you have to do those on your own. Users on the Omnipod 5 should set the lowest target possible. So if you have the updated software that lets you set 100 as the target, do that. Otherwise, use 110. They recommend turning off the reverse correction feature. And that's a feature that would, the reverse correction lowers bolus doses if the glucose is below target going into a meal. But having that turned on increases the risk of a
high after the meal. So turning that off during pregnancy is suggested, and also setting a short active insulin time of 2 to 3 hours. And then people who are using the twist system or the open source loop system are encouraged to use the pre-meal temporary target as often as possible, because that lowers the glucose heading into a meal and minimizes the post-meal rise. The maximum basal should be set at least 5 times the highest program basal rate so that the system can adjust things as necessary. So, for example, if your highest basal rate is zero point 0.8, you would want to set your maximum basal at 5 or higher. And again, use a very short absorption time when entering meals in order to maximize the bolus that's given and minimize that post-meal rise. Some other general recommendations to follow during pregnancy. One is to be cautious of prolonged basal shutoffs, even though that may be necessary to prevent hypoglycemia in some cases. A prolonged basal shutoff can lead to ketone production, which is dangerous to the developing baby. Consider that insulin absorption is slower as the pregnancy proceeds. So particularly in the second and later the third trimesters, insulin is going to take longer to absorb from below the skin. So bolusing earlier than usual is necessary to achieve those post-meal targets. Afrezza, the inhaled insulin, is something to consider during pregnancy, even if you're using a pump or using an automated system, because the Afrezza works so much faster and clears so much faster than traditional rapid acting and ultra rapid insulins. It's very effective for managing post meal spikes. Afrezza is going to receive FDA clearance during pregnancy shortly. They've completed studies and it is safe to use. But if you are using an automated system along with it, it's important to either announce that you've taken that insulin or turn off automation for a few hours after taking Afrezza. And one other strategy that was suggested is a kind of an old school technique that was developed by my friend and colleague, John Walsh. And that's to use something called a super bolus. A super bolus involves adding to your meal bolus the amount of basal that you would have received for the next few hours, and then turning the basal off for a couple of hours. So let's say your basal rate is 0.6 and you're about to bolus 4 units for a meal. You could take 2 units of basal insulin, which would be 1 point, and add that to your 4-unit meal dose. So you would take 5.2 and then turn the basal off for a few hours. By getting a little more insulin working as early as possible, it also helps to reduce those immediate post-meal spikes. And there was good news for Tandem. Their pump, their Control IQ system was approved for use during pregnancy. This is the first automated insulin delivery system has FDA approval for pregnancy use. Well, that's all great. Thanks for sharing that, my brother. Now, what about new products? Everybody wants to know about new products in development in the diabetes space. So what kind of items did you see when you were touring the exhibit hall and attending those sessions? Thank you, Buck. You bring up a great topic. I'm always excited about new things that are in development and things that are recently approved so we can start making effective use of them. I had a chance to play around a little bit with Tandem's upcoming tubeless Mobi pump. It's a really nice system. It's really going to be the same pump that the Mobi is currently. They're really just changing the cartridge that attaches to it. So the tubeless system won't be feeding the insulin into a tube. It's going to feed it into a sort of a patch that sits on the skin and the pump clicks into. So the pump will infuse the insulin directly into the patch. And the patch for their tubeless model has their new steady set, which is an extended wear infusion set that can be used for upwards of a week. And they found that it was 84% of users were able to get a full 7 days out of the steady set without any significant problems. So that's something to really look forward to. Now, that steady set will be available for users of the T-Slim pump, the tubed pump, shortly after it launches for the tubeless model. And incidentally, the tubeless Mobi pump will likely launch in the fourth quarter of this year. But of course, there's a lot of variables involved. So that's just a rough estimate. So this tubeless Mobi pump has a single button on it for administering boluses in fixed unit increments, which is nice because if you don't have your phone, you really can't program anything else on this device. So having that button is helpful. And the pump itself can be removed and reinserted into the same patch on the skin as many times as you like. So you can disconnect from your pump for sports, for recreational activities, things like that. I still remember wearing my pump in a hot tub years ago, and I cooked my insulin. But with this one, you can take the pump off temporarily and then snap it back in pretty easily. So that was one new thing I saw. Another was MiniMed's new pump called the Flex. I got to handle that and play around with it a bit. It is about half the size of their current 780G pump. When you add the clip to it, it does add some size because the clip wraps around the full case, but it is a bit smaller. The pump itself doesn't have any programming buttons on it. So all of the programming is done through a smartphone app. And I can tell you the smartphone app is a lot easier to program than the 780G pump is. You don't have to scroll through a gazillion menus and press a lot of buttons. It's very, very smooth to program. So I do like that. Omnipod shared some data on their next system called Omnipod 6. The main change involves the algorithm itself. They're making the algorithm a little bit more responsive to rapid glucose rises. It's the sort of thing that happens if you forget to bolus for a meal or a snack. So if people do forget to bolus, it'll be pretty aggressive at covering what was eaten. I mean, you'll still see a rise, but it won't be as much as it was with the Omnipod 5. So they're seeing overall more time in range with the Omnipod 6 than with the 5, at least in the clinical studies. They've also adjusted some of the prerequisites for being in automated mode. It won't kick the user out of automated mode as easily. It'll stay in automated mode more often, which is certainly good for the user. A couple of other medication or drug developments. Novo Nordisk just got FDA approval on a once weekly injectable basal insulin called icodec. This insulin is highly concentrated, and that allows you to take a reasonable dose. And it has additives that make it sort of dissociate in the bloodstream very slowly. So that's what gives it its lasting ability. So someone could take a dose of this on Sunday and not have to take another shot of basal insulin until the following Sunday. It's only been approved for use for type 2 diabetes because they did find some increases in hypoglycemia risk with this insulin compared to traditional long-acting insulins like Lantus and Tresiba and Toujeo. So it's intended initially for type 2s. So type 1s would have to wait until it's FDA approved for use in type 1 diabetes. One other exciting medication news item involves an immunosuppressant drug called, and I have a hard time pronouncing this, tegoprubart. I know I'm mispronouncing it, but people in the know just call it Tego. It's a new type of immunosuppressant drug that has far fewer side effects than the immunosuppression drugs we've been using up to this point. And it's very important because anyone who receives an islet cell transplant is going to need to take an immune suppression drug to keep the body from rejecting those cells. This new Tego immune suppression drug seems to be a lot more tolerable, fewer side effects than what we've seen in the past. And now we have a company, Vertex, that has a line of stem cells that they've basically synthesized and they can replicate and hopefully provide stem cells for eventually for everybody that needs them. So if we have a very effective immune suppression to go with it, we may be getting closer to a cure for type 1. It's been studied and tested in a handful of people at the University of, I think it's the University of Chicago. It might be University of Illinois in Chicago. But either way, it's in Chicago or near Chicago. And the people who've received these Vertex islet cells and the Tego immune suppression are doing quite well. They've managed to stay off insulin for some time now. So those were the main new products, the new things that I saw. Well, what about some of the older stuff, things that have been on the market, some of the meds that, type 1s might like to use, but they just can't get them approved and get insurance coverage? What are some things we've learned about that, or has anything changed on that front? Well, Buck, there have been some changes, and there has been some new research that's taken place. I'll start with a class of drugs called SGLT2 inhibitors. These are oral medications that lower the renal threshold for glucose. And what that means is that these medications cause your kidneys to eliminate sugar through the urine. Normally, when our blood sugar gets very high, that happens anyway. But with these medications, you'll be spilling sugar in the urine even when your blood sugar is normal. It's been used for type 2 patients for quite some time, and it has a number of benefits besides lowering blood sugar levels. It also can induce some weight loss since you're urinating calories away when the sugar spills, and they've found some kidney benefits in using it. So use in type 1 diabetes has been discouraged for the most part because they found an increased risk of ketoacidosis in people with type 1 diabetes who use these SGLT2 medications. So Johns Hopkins University did a study to really test that out. What they did is they educated the users, these type 1 patients, on safety protocols and how to minimize the risk of ketoacidosis. It was things like making sure they eat on a regular basis, they're not going long periods of fasting, making sure they stay well hydrated, also teaching them to troubleshoot and see if they have ketones present if glucose levels start to climb. And what they found was that the subjects in the study, again, these are type 1s taking SGLT2 inhibitors, saw about a 22% reduction in cardiovascular events, a 28% reduction in kidney problems, plus the usual reduction in blood sugar and a little bit of weight loss. And this is key, with no incidence of ketoacidosis during the study. So apparently a little bit of education can go a long way in using these meds safely. Roche is a company that hasn't been very active in the drug space, at least in the type 1 drug space. They had an investigative medication called acmopatide, and this is a GLP-1 medication that also has a medication called a GIP. So it's similar to some of the commercial products like Mounjaro and Zepbound. And they tested it in people with type 1 diabetes for 4 months. And it produced about a 7% weight loss, an A1C reduction of a little more than 0.3, about a 15% reduction in insulin requirements, and a decrease in post-meal blood sugar spikes. And they didn't find any episodes of ketoacidosis during the study, no severe hypoglycemia during the study either. So it sounds like it has a lot of potential to be used in people with type 1. For whatever reason, Roche has decided not to pursue this, not to move on to phase 3 trials, but it does lay the groundwork for other companies to develop similar types of medications for type 1 diabetes. Now, Lilly, for one, is doing a phase 3 trial on the safety and efficacy of Mounjaro, which is one of those GLP-1 GIP medications, and specifically for people with type 1 diabetes. They're currently conducting the study. We'll see the results in the coming months. Hopefully, they won't be like Roche and give up on it when it appears to succeed. Lilly has a little more staying power, I think, when it comes to these kind of drugs. Now, the GLP-1s, for the most part, are injected on a weekly basis. Pfizer announced study results on a once-monthly version of their GLP-1 medication. It's called berobenatide. Now, they studied this only in patients with type 2 diabetes who were overweight for a period of 28 weeks. And taking it on a monthly basis, it produced over 10% weight loss and an A1C reduction. And get this, an A1C reduction of 2.2%. That's huge. That's in just a 6 to 7 week trial to lower the A1C that much is pretty significant. And the safety profile and the efficacy was very similar as the weekly GLP-1s. So it'll get easier just taking it once a month once that's available.
Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, is brought to you by Integrated Diabetes Services, where experience meets expertise, passion meets compassion, and diabetes care is personal because we live it too. Our team of clinicians, all living with type 1 diabetes, understands the challenges firsthand. We're here to help no matter where you are in the world. From glucose management to self-care strategies, the latest tech, sports and exercise, weight loss, type 1 pregnancy, and emotional well-being, we've got you covered. We offer consultations in English and Spanish via phone, video chat, email, and text. Want to learn more? Visit integrateddiabetes.com or email info@integrateddiabetes.com to schedule a consultation.
All right. Now, that's all well and good. You mentioned these things called ketones. Is that like the ketone cops since you're from Pennsylvania? No, Buck. Ketones are not the same as the Keystone cops. Those are the Pennsylvania cops in the old black and white movies. But ketones are an important thing for everybody with type 1 diabetes to consider. Ketones are acid molecules that we produce when we're burning fat for energy. Now, ketones can be used as an energy source, but if they accumulate in large amounts, they cause the bloodstream and the body's tissues to become too acidic. And if you see a blood sugar rise at the same time and become dehydrated, you can go into ketoacidosis. So ketones are a potential problem, for everybody with type 1. Abbott, which is the company that develops the Libre sensors, they've developed a sensor that doesn't just measure glucose levels, it also measures ketone levels continuously. They already received approval for this in Europe, and they're looking to receive approval shortly in the United States. And this is an important thing because just in the United States alone, there are about 250,000 hospitalizations each year for DKA, and the risk goes up, particularly in people who are of an advanced age and also in adolescence. People who are in low socioeconomic groups or minorities are also at higher risk. It's one of the leading causes of death among people with type 1 diabetes. And those who have more frequent episodes of DKA have an even greater risk. Our insulin emission is the most common, but also new onset of type 1 diabetes is often accompanied by DKA. Infection can lead to DKA, and in some cases, SGLT2 inhibitor use can cause it. Pump malfunctions used to be a significant source of DKA, but as the equipment's improved and the tubing and infusion sets have improved, we're not seeing it very often anymore. It only happens to about 1 to 2% of pump users each year. So using a continuous ketone monitor provides a number of benefits. It can certainly help us troubleshoot pump problems. So if we've got an unusually high glucose value, we can see if the ketone levels are rising as well and know that the pump's probably not delivering any insulin. During illness, knowing what our ketone level is and whether it's rising or falling can help with treatment of the illness, as well as knowing how much extra insulin we're likely to need. I mentioned earlier that ketones during pregnancy are particularly dangerous, so monitoring ketones continuously can help produce better pregnancy outcomes. For type 1s who want to use an SGLT2 inhibitor, it can certainly make it safer to do so if we know if our ketone levels are starting to climb. For people who are transitioning from early stage type 1 diabetes, like before symptoms even appear, tracking ketone levels can also be a way to prevent DKA at diagnosis. And I think, all the people out there who are trying to follow those ketogenic diets can track their ketone levels with this type of a sensor. So, early detection of ketones definitely allows for more effective treatment and prevention of DKA. And just as a reminder, optimal treatment involves taking insulin by injection. And the experts at the conference recommend taking a little more than you would normally need to cover a high reading. So if you're ketotic and your glucose is elevated, you should probably add about 20 to the dose you would give yourself to fix that high. Fluids are essential, as is carbohydrate intake, because we need to be burning glucose also as a way to help dissipate ketone levels. All right, that sounds good. I'm looking forward to that dual sensor coming out. All right, now I know you're into them workouts and stuff and like to stay in good shape. I just ride my horse. I figure at least the horse gets a workout, but was there any good news there at the conference there about exercise? Well, I got to tell you first, I got a lot of walking in at that conference. There were days where I was over 15,000 steps, just walking around the exhibit hall, walking from education session from one meeting room to another. Conference center where this was down in New Orleans was really spread out. So you sometimes had to walk huge distances to get from one place to another. So I got a lot of walking in, and I was able to avoid my lows for the most part by lowering the aggressiveness on my insulin pump. Sitting is something that is a whole different story. When you're sitting in at conferences and meetings, there's a tendency for blood sugars to rise a bit. But there was a session specifically about the ill effects of long periods of sitting. One study showed that taking just short little activity breaks of just a couple of minutes really helps to improve glucose control and reduces just risk of overall death. They call these exercise snacks. Since they're short, they just last a couple of minutes. Another study showed that engaging in at least 150 minutes or 2.5 hours of moderate to vigorous exercise each week can help offset some of the effects of long-term sitting. So those of us who have sedentary jobs got to make sure we get our workouts in. Automated insulin delivery systems were studied as a way to prevent hypoglycemia based on heart rate. They actually hooked a pump up to a heart rate monitor, and the pump would decrease insulin delivery when the heart rate would increase. And it was a very effective tool for preventing hypoglycemia during different types of exercise. So hopefully the companies that make our pumps and our closed loop systems now will get the hint and have a motion sensor built into the pump, or perhaps link a step counter to the pump and have the pump adjust the delivery based on the activity level. There was some discussion about post-meal blood sugar rises that many people see. We usually expect the glucose to continue dropping after most workouts just because we're more sensitive to insulin for a while. What they found was that prolonged endurance type exercise will often deplete our glycogen stores in our muscles and our liver, and that for a short while after the workout, the body might convert over to fat metabolism for a while, and that'll spare the glucose in the bloodstream. So that can cause, or at least be partially responsible for the rise. Now, one of the more interesting sessions I attended that specific to exercise had to do with the timing of workouts. Now, you know me, Buck, I've never been a morning person. I like doing my workouts late in the day. For that matter, I like doing everything late in the day. I'm just not a morning guy. But the research has always shown that people stick with their exercise plans better and longer when they exercise in the morning. We also know that early morning exercise makes it much easier to control blood sugars because the glucose doesn't drop much at that time of day during a workout. But performance is another story. There's a very interesting paper presented that showed that peak cardiovascular performance takes place about 10 hours after a person wakes up. So it's related to our sleep-wake cycle and that circadian rhythm. So if you wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're going to get your peak performance sometime around 6 p.m. from a cardio standpoint. Now, they traced it back to the mitochondria in our cells and their ability to oxidize, and that seemed to be related to why performance was better. And the type of exercise was also evaluated. You might have heard of a type of workout called high-intensity interval training. And this is where you alternate during a workout session, something that's real high intensity with a little bit of time at a low intensity. So, for example, you might run full speed for a minute and then jog slowly for 4 minutes and then repeat that over and over. And that type of workout seems to produce a lot of benefits over steady state cardio type exercise. It seems to produce better cardiac function, lower lipid levels, more time in target range with blood sugar. And that may be related to some adrenaline production that we get during those high intensity stages. We see better fat and carbohydrate breakdown, a better level of insulin sensitivity. And interestingly, they surveyed the participants and they reported more satisfaction with their HIIT workouts, the high intensity interval training workouts, than with steady state cardio. I mean, it might be that they're more interesting, more challenging, who knows, but people seem to like them better. And they also answered that age-old question about whether people with type 1 diabetes can be as fit as people without diabetes. And the answer is yes and no. There are some physiologic differences, particularly after age 40. They find that recovery time takes longer in people with type 1 diabetes. And there's also a little bit fewer mitochondria in the muscle cells of people with type 1 diabetes. So there's a tendency to have to work harder and train more to get to a certain state of cardio conditioning. But we've seen time and time again that people with type 1, with proper training, can achieve at least the same level of fitness that people without diabetes get to. But that recovery time after age 40, it has implications for how we schedule our workouts. Strength training, resistance workouts and high impact exercises. You may want to take a day break between those to allow for recovery. And you can do low intensity workouts or low impact workouts on the off days, but doing high impact workouts 2 days in a row is not a great idea. All right, that's all good to know. I'll tell my horse about that the next time they're exercising. I've read that type 1 diabetes actually can be prevented now. Used to be you get it, and ain't nothing you can do about it. But we got these medications now that can slow down development. Did you learn any more about that? Actually, I did. A couple things I learned about it. For one thing, we've had a drug on the market called Tzield. Generic name is teplizumab, and that's been shown to slow the progression of type 1 diabetes from stage 2 to stage 3. So people who are not having symptoms of high blood sugar, but their glucose levels are slightly elevated, can slow the development of full type 1 by taking that drug. It's an IV administered drug. It was just approved for use in stage 3, meaning that even after you're diagnosed, for the first couple of months, you're eligible to use this drug to slow continued progression. And that means you can stay in your honeymoon phase of your diabetes much longer. It could go on for years longer than you expected it to. And time is valuable, because the longer we can keep our glucose levels close to normal, the less work we have to do, but also the closer we get to a cure. And that keeps us healthy long term. There was also a very detailed report about a drug called verapamil. And this is a blood pressure drug. It's been on the market for decades. It's a very inexpensive generic type of a drug. They found that at low doses, it seems to have an impact on the T cells. These are the cells that contribute to beta cell destruction as part of the autoimmune process. There were researchers at Stanford that studied these low doses of verapamil given to kids in their early stages of type 1 diabetes, where they were newly diagnosed but could still produce some insulin on their own. And the ones who took the verapamil were able to continue producing their own insulin at higher levels for quite some time. Over the course of several years, people who took this drug saw more insulin production. So that's a potential tool that can be used in order to preserve beta cell function. Now, technically, it's not yet FDA approved for that indication. However, it is something that can be prescribed in an off-label format. And likewise, we also learned about how to predict whether your early stage diabetes, stage 1, stage 2, is going to progress to stage 3 based on CGM data. So even before you're symptomatic, before the glucose levels are very high, use of a CGM can be really helpful. And what we're looking for isn't the average or the time in range. We're really looking at the variability. The more variability there is in the glucose levels, the more likely the person is to progress pretty soon to the next stage of their diabetes. All right, appreciate you sharing all that. That's good news for those kids out there and even the adults who were recently diagnosed. Okay, now I'm trying to keep awake here, and it's not so easy because you're not the most exciting speaker and all. But did you learn anything about sleep when you was at this conference? I've heard that sleep can have a major impact on diabetes and life in general. We've learned a lot about the role of sleep in general in diabetes management. Inadequate or poor quality sleep has an effect on hormone levels, specifically cortisol and another hormone called leptin. Leptin is an appetite suppressant type of a hormone, and cortisol is a stress hormone. And the body produces less leptin when we don't get enough sleep. It produces more cortisol, so that interferes with blood sugar control. There was a really interesting study with kids on sleep patterns. It ends up kids with type 1 diabetes get about half an hour less sleep per night than kids without type 1 diabetes. And it's not so much the duration, but the quality of their sleep that makes such a big difference. They found that certain factors were associated with less time in one's target blood sugar range. One of them is spending excessive amounts of time sleeping. People have worse blood sugar control when they sleep too much. Another is varying the times that one goes to sleep. Having a more consistent sleep cycle, in other words, going to bed and getting up at about the same times each day, is highly beneficial. And also the number of times a person gets up during the night. That certainly influences sleep quality and can impact those hormones that can affect blood sugar levels. So at least in kids, we learn these valuable things. It's not just how long you sleep, it's the sleep quality, the timing, and even the consistency of sleep cycles is really critical. I can just picture trying to tell one of my kids that even on non-school days, they got to get up at the same hour. That wouldn't go over so well, but at least trying to get them to be closer on their wake up times to their school days can really help. So a couple of other just last minute miscellaneous things that I came across. Dexcom did a study that doesn't really impact type 1 so much, but it is going to impact the diabetes community. They tested use of the Dexcom CGM. I think specifically it was their Stelo, but wearing a continuous glucose monitor, even if you don't take insulin, seems to have a lot of beneficial effect. So they tested people who were using a CGM and not using a CGM. These were all non-insulin users. And they found that the people who use CGMs had lower A1C levels. Apparently, they're learning things from their own data, and they're probably making better decisions through the course of the day, and they're keeping their blood sugars within a healthier range. So that data was presented, and it's very likely that the FDA is going to approve CGM use for people who are not on insulin, and Medicare will start covering it for those people. And that can make a big difference. Open source community, people who develop these platforms like Loop and Trio and OpenAPS, they've hacked into the Omnipod 5. Up till now, we're mostly using Omnipod Dash as the pump in our AID systems. But Insulet is planning to stop making the Dash pod sometime next year. So that's got everybody a little concerned. But it looks like we won't have to go off of it because we'll be able to use the Omnipod 5s. Even I met a couple of the code writers, and they were actually using the Omnipod 5 with their Loop systems at the meeting. And one other just product that I came across that I was pretty excited about was a new kind of low blood sugar treatment called Dextro Energy. It's made by a German company, and they're these square white tablets that are kind of scored in the middle so you can break them in half easily if you want to. Each one is 5 grams, so you can break it off into a 2.5 gram tablet if you want. They come in an individually cellophane wrap that it's very easy to open. They have a little pull tab on them. So when I'm low, it's sometimes hard to get the shrink wrap off of our hypo treatments. But best of all, they actually tasted good. They didn't have that kind of sour taste that most Dex tabs have. They actually tasted just sugary and sweet, and it was a pleasant flavor. It reminded me of the BD glucose tablets that were available like 20, 30 years ago. These came in a blister pack. They were these big white horse pills. They tasted pretty good, though, so I didn't mind eating them when my blood sugar was low. But these Dextro Energy tablets, I like them. I actually had to keep myself from snacking on them when I wasn't low. They actually tasted that good. So we'll probably see more of that available in the coming months and years. But it was at least nice to see someone paying attention to us and developing a product like that we're excited about. So that's my report from the ADA Scientific Sessions 2026. I hope you found some useful information there. Please reach out to our practice if you'd like some more details about any of the new research and applying it in your own personal diabetes care. And everyone out there, don't forget now, Buck, what do I always like to say? I know this one. Don't forget to think like a pancreas. Thanks, Buck. You got it.
Thanks for tuning in to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. On behalf of Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, I'm Gary Scheiner, Wishing you a fantastic week ahead, and don't forget to think like a pancreas.